Chapter 10 Hamlin, in which Peter learns something of the bureaucracy of conquest, commits a grave crime, and then does it again. Peter realized he was dying. Only a month ago, he'd presented himself at the south gates of the walled town of Hamlin, certain that all of his trials had come to an end. But instead of reaching the glorious refuge of his imagination, he'd found a Hamlin that had already been overrun by invader troops from the far empire. These occupiers were a strange and frightening bunch, which he was able to examine up close for the first time. The human troops must have been the officers, because, like all leaders, they kept remote from the town's general populace. But it was the horrific goblin soldiers who mixed with the townsfolk, patrolling the streets and manning the gates and street corners. Hamlin was a vast walled city home to tens of thousands. It was roughly circular in shape and pressed up like a jealous lover against the eastern bank of the Weser River, which flowed almost due north at this point in its meanderings. A deep moat had been diverted from the river to ring the town, just outside of its high walls. 3 great gate towers straddled both wall and moat at 3 of the 4 cardinal points of the compass, north, east, and south. To the west there were 2 more gates, one opening onto a wide, fortified stone bridge that spanned the Weser, leading to a separate castle fortress on the west bank, and a second gate that opened onto a smaller bridge that led to a sliver of forested island in the middle of the river, dividing the river in twain for about 500 meters. In addition to the gate towers, 17 tall stone towers were spaced along the wall's circumference, making Hamlin a truly imposing city. A town like this could repel the direct attacks of any army and withstand a siege that lasted years, Peter had believed when he first arrived. But the enemy invaders who occupied Hamlin had apparently done so without inflicting any visible damage on its unscarred battlements. Peter had arrived at the south gate just as a long line of wagons, each piled high with the produce of the fall harvest, was entering the city. One of the rotund goblin guards simply waved him in as he approached, no doubt assuming he was part of the company of farmers delivering their goods. The goblin paid no further attention to him, even though he couldn't help but gape in open astonishment at the creature. Like those he'd seen, only from a distance, back at the Peep estate, this one had beady black eyes and green leathery skin. Up close, he could see the thing's skin was spotted with ugly cankers and scored with deep, badly healed scars from past battles. Yellow tusks protruded from its oversized lower jaw, and its meaty fingers ended in thick, stubby claws. Its breath, even while standing more or less at rest, heaved louder than a blacksmith's bellows, and it stank of sulphur and rot. It wore black armor over a coat of chainmail and carried a long spear, which looked anything but decorative. "Move along," the goblin croaked in a rough approximation of the Hessian tongue. "Don't clog the gate." And so Peter did as instructed. As much as he was tempted to flee from the city and its terrifying conquerors, the plan among the 2 families was that they'd all meet up in Hamlin should they become separated. If any of the others had survived, they simply must be here by now, Peter thought, goblins or no. I can't even consider abandoning my family, or Bo Peep, or any of her sisters or parents. So, seeing no other choice, he'd entered. If anything, Hamlin seemed bigger on the inside than out, and it was crowded with more people than Peter had ever imagined existing at all, much less squeezed into one place. From the bits of chatter he could overhear just by having to struggle through the crowds, he'd learned that many, or most, of them were recent arrivals and refugees, just like he was. They journeyed from smaller towns and homesteads all over the countryside, some of which had been burned during the invasion, while others had been forcibly taken for the sole use of the invaders. A town this crowded will make it harder for me to find my own friends and family, he thought. Then again, it might help me stay free longer to look for them, since one small boy can better lose himself in a crowd, the bigger the better. But Peter couldn't start looking for the others yet. He'd arrived here with only the clothes on his back, frost in its dull leather carrying case, and nothing else. More than ever he dearly missed those 17 fat gold marks that he'd been forced to abandon in the deep woods. Peter was experienced enough to know one absolute and unchanging rule of any town, no matter who ruled it. No money meant nothing to eat. The first thing he'd have to do, even before beginning to look for his loved ones, was to find a tavern or guest house, play his pipe, and pass the hat. Of course, that assumed he'd be able to borrow a hat. His had been left in the long-lost campsite, along with the gold. "Has the rot gotten to your head, boy?" the innkeeper said, after Peter had proposed to play for his evening customers. "There's no singing and playing aloud in public houses no more. Not since the Gobs took over. It's forbidden now. Are you trying to get yourself chopped into bits? Or worse yet, are you trying to get me killed?" "I didn't know," Peter said. "I'm new here and—" "Well, that's no excuse, is it? Just ask those who tried to plead ignorance. You can usually find their heads lining the east wall, provided the crows and rats haven't got to them yet. You've got to learn the rules, boy, or a gob-axe will fix you certain." It was the same in every other public house that Peter had tried. One innkeeper had actually struck him just for asking, lest any of his customers overhear him even having such a conversation and think to curry favor by denouncing him to the guards. After a night spent cold and hungry, sleeping in an alley, Peter had decided to look for other kinds of work that didn't involve playing music. He quickly found there was none of that to be found either. "I can't let you work, young man," a stable owner named Kropf told him. "Not without a pass signed by the new Ministry of Labor. Not even a single sweep of the broom can I allow you." "How can I get such a pass?" Peter asked. "Well, that part's easy enough. First, you present yourself down to the ministry offices and tell them who you are and how long you've lived in Hamlin and answer any other questions they think to ask. Then you wait to see if they issue a pass or cart you off to a slave camp. I'm told a gift of some kind to the desk sergeant can be helpful in that particular." "I don't have anything I could offer as a gift, though," Peter said. "No matter," Kropf said. "Even if you could get a signed pass, you'd never find a job anyway. They're all gone by now. I can't spare a bit of work or even a crust to pay you with. Mostly now, I think the ministry only keeps its doors open to lure in the less wary vagrants and street tramps. It's the labor camps for you, I fear." "But if I don't find a job soon, I'll have to leave the city in order to feed myself." "You can't do that either," Kropf said. "Unless you get a different pass from the Ministry of Travel. The new overlords don't want people just wandering free and unregistered about their countryside now, do they?" "But I got into the city without a pass." "I'm not surprised. They want you in the bigger cities and towns. Easier to scoop you up then. No, young fellow, I fear it's the camps for you. Best turn yourself in now and get that first bowl of dinner all the sooner." And so it went. Peter had no documentation, but documents of some type or another were required for anything he might try to do to stave off hunger. Even begging was regulated in this strange new empire. Beggars required their own brand of written license to do so, which were issued by the Ministry of Charity. Unfortunately, the Ministry of Charity was no more charitable than any other of the town's uncountable regulatory offices. Hamlin was limited to no more than 30 such passes, and the waiting list to get one was already over 1,000 names long, or so Peter had heard. He wasn't willing to enter any government building to find out for himself. With no other recourse, Peter turned to eating garbage, but in a city as crowded as this, there was precious little of that to be found, and what he could find was often difficult to keep. Usually, he had to be willing to fight others for it. Scavenging turned increasingly difficult as the days went by. Most of the other vagrants, finding themselves in the same position as Peter, formed gangs of desperate ruffians, all the better to fight off other gangs for the few scraps that could be discovered. Peter refused to join one of the gangs, since the standard rite of initiation required killing some smaller, weaker street dweller to prove one's will and ability to do all to serve the gang and to survive. He continued to sleep in alleys and gutters, but never for more than an hour or two at a time. Patrols of the Goblin Night Watch regularly searched likely places where street tramps might be found. Some of the bolder gangs were even worse, routinely killing those they could find still living on their own, so as to keep its reputation growing, its members in fighting trim, and to reduce the number of mouths competing for the available food trash. The rat populations were increasing too, as they always did, in a place where the human population is so much greater than the available food supply. The dead and dying may have been too terrible a food source for most of the town's starving people to yet contemplate, but they proved a wonderful feast for rats. Turnabout being fair play, many of the street dwellers started hunting rats. Peter tried it, with limited success. On most days, Peter was too weak from hunger to succeed in catching and killing one of the big Hamlin rats with only his bare hands and teeth as weapons. They were tough, fast, and fought viciously when cornered. On those rare occasions when he did triumph, Peter ate the thing raw, meat and guts both. Then, strengthened just a bit, he usually celebrated by taking the rest of the day off to search for his lost friends and family. His reasoning was sound for the most part. If one or more of them had survived to make it here, there was a chance, slight though it may have been, that they'd done so with their gold in hand. Peter's greatest fantasy in those rough days consisted of finding his mother, or Max, or any of the peeps, and discovering that they lived like kings, with plenty to eat, surrounded, in fact, with every type of treat one could imagine. He seldom thought of Beau, or at least tried not to, because he no longer felt worthy of her. He couldn't bear what he'd become, a human version of vermin, a filthy rat in the streets, and knew that she'd be justifiably shocked and appalled by him now. Sometimes he thought of his father, and when he did, he imagined a terrible sight of many scarred and bearded soldiers standing over an unrecognizable thing on the wet forest floor. They wore his father's blood, spattered over their face and skin and clothes, and didn't mind it. Each one of them looked as frightening as Max had on that unspeakable night so long ago. When he could, he went from door to door in one of the town's 16 distinct residential neighborhoods, asking after his lost ones. Most of the time, he'd had the door slammed in his face before he could get his story told. The residents of Hamlin were learning not to talk to strangers for any reason. None of the few willing to listen to his plight had ever heard of anyone named Peep or Piper. No one he spoke to ever had a crust or a scrap to spare, and most were shocked to see someone beg without a license. In addition to the residents, any one of whom might think it prudent to turn him in, he had to be careful to avoid the guard patrols. On more than one occasion, they tried to run him down. So far, he'd managed to outrun them, scampering into the hidden warrens and shadows that any big town offered, and which he was learning in minute detail. But he was getting weaker, and therefore slower by the day, while the goblins, though not as fleet of foot as the average humans, were always well fed. Sooner rather than later, they'd catch him sure enough. Once recently, one lucky gob had actually gotten a hand around Frost's carrying case, which Peter still wore slung over his back. When he could feel the strap slipping, about to hitch up to where it would either come free of his hand or choke him around his neck, Peter had suddenly stopped running, turned, and kicked the massive goblin in his large round belly. His attack couldn't possibly have hurt the creature, but the gob was so surprised by the bold act that it let go of Frost's case, and Peter got away. That sort of miracle wasn't likely to happen twice. When nearly a month had passed since his arrival in town, Peter had to admit to himself that he was dying. Slowly, to be sure, but dying just the same. The days had steadily grown colder and wetter as winter approached, and he'd grown too weak to succeed much longer in avoiding or outrunning each one of the many dangers in this very dangerous place. In desperation, he considered his remaining options. First, he could turn himself in to the occupying soldiers and be taken off into one of their slave camps. He knew that in his frail condition he probably wouldn't last long, but at least he might get to eat something close to a real meal again before the end. The second option was to try to steal the food he had no way to pay for, or earn in any other honorable way. The idea was abhorrent to him, especially so in light of his brother's past accusation that he was nothing but a dirty thief all along. How long ago was that? It seemed so distant, but it couldn't have been more than 2 months past. How odd back then that Peter hadn't any idea he'd ever want for enough to eat. The third option was the most alarming to imagine. He could try to find some way to sell Frost, his only thing of value, or trade it for something else. But even in his terrible state, knowing full well he was dying, the idea seemed monstrous to him. He'd promised to guard and cherish Frost always, ultimately surrendering it only when he had a son he could pass it on to. It was the first oath he'd ever taken as a man. He'd sworn a sacred vow to his father only 2 nights before his father was slaughtered at the hands of the very invaders who were killing him now, in dull and numbing increments. No, he couldn't do it. No matter what else happened, Peter couldn't willingly dispose of Frost and thereby bring a dire curse down on all of his surviving family and their offspring until the end of time. If Peter were doomed to die, he'd have to devise some clever, solitary way to do it, whereby Frost would be buried with him for all time, never to be discovered by another. By keeping Frost with him, even after death, he'd stave off any chance of the curse falling on others. Devising such a plan would take time and require a clear mind. So first, he'd have to try just once more to live. Since he couldn't part with Frost, and since turning himself over to the soldiers would also result in losing the magical treasure, Peter would attempt the only remaining option. He'd fulfill his brother's prophecy and become a thief. Halfway along Fish Door Street, just before it jogged north towards the city wall, which was called the Wall of Chestnut Trees in this section, was the public house identified by the sign of the Red Mare, rearing over a coiled green serpent. Most people simply called it the Horse and Snake. Like most public houses, several sections of its front wall, that part directly facing the street, could be removed during the warmest part of a sunny day so as to keep the interior cool and to be more inviting to potential customers. Also, like most such establishments, the Horse and Snake always had a big cauldron of stew simmering near the street. Such stews were commonly called belly vengeance, because it was a cheap and horrible concoction made up of rotting wastes and leftovers. It was constantly added to throughout the day, replenished with anything that could possibly go into the pot, including the dirty scrub water and the sweepings from the floor. A public house's vat of belly vengeance was sold for a halfpenny a bowl. Often the bowl was actually a hollowed crust of stale bread, so that no one had to worry about recovering and cleaning the dishes. Only the town's most wretched souls would buy it, as the single daily meal they could afford. This was why the stew pot was commonly kept out close to the street, since no decent pub owner wanted such disreputable scum entering the actual establishment, where the more respectable, meaning wealthier, customers dined. Peter examined the exterior of the Horse and Snake from his vantage point, a dark and narrow alleyway across the street and not 3 doors down from it. He watched several customers come and go, paying their halfpenny to an old man stationed out on a stool near the pot, which simmered over a wide, flat iron pan of hot coals. Most of them would take their time, selecting the biggest, most bowl-like crust available to dip as deeply as they could into the belly vengeance. Then they'd continue on their way, walking as they ate. If they dared try to linger too near the pub to eat, the red-faced manager would quickly rush outside to shoo them on their way. When too long a time passed between customers, the old man guarding the pot would often begin to doze on his stool, his back pressed against that part of the pub's street-side facade still in place. Now that Peter had the old man's pattern down, he got ready to move. As soon as the fellow began to doze again, he sprang into action, dashing as fast as he could, out of the alleyway and across the street. Almost without pausing, he grabbed a crust from out of the big half-barrel, shoved it deep into the stew, almost scalding his hand in the process, and ran off with his stolen treasure. Peter immediately began eating as he ran, pouring the hot stew into his open mouth as fast as it would go. It was glorious. It might have been the finest meal he'd ever enjoyed. Most of it was brown, greasy broth, but the broth was thick, almost as thick as a proper gravy, and he was almost certain he'd gotten a chunk of potato. Or perhaps it was a rutabaga, and there was most definitely some bit of meat. Peter heard a yawp of surprise behind him as the old man snorted and sputtered back to wakefulness, but there was no chance he could catch Peter, who'd carefully chosen just this pub on just this street because of how winding the serpentine street was, with many a dim and narrow alleyway leading off from it. Peter chose an alley more or less at random and disappeared into it, giggling with delight as he sucked the last dregs of stew out of the bread. Then he paused to scrape every bit of cooling broth off his face and then lick his fingers clean before turning to the bread itself. It had been dry and several days stale, but the hot gravy softened it just fine. Peter ate it in 3 huge bites, and it was better than the stew itself. He walked deeper into the alley, grinning with pride at his accomplishment. Great Jorg himself, heroic warrior bard of old, would have been proud of his mighty deed. He was tempted to pull Frost out of its case this very moment and compose a song in praise of his daring exploit on the spot. He almost did it. Almost. Over the next few days, Peter struck time and again, swooping down on a badly guarded stew pot 2 and sometimes 3 times a day. It was easy. He never got caught, because he was always careful to scout the area thoroughly before he struck. If there were goblin patrols anywhere within 2 city blocks, he'd wait. If one of the public house's legitimate customers looked too fit or, in some way, able to give pursuit, he'd moved on and select a different location. There were perhaps 400 cauldrons of belly vengeance brewing on any given day, and Peter was determined to sample each and every one of them in time. Now that he ate several times each day, his health was coming back, and as his strength returned, he grew bolder. With the winter rapidly approaching, there was more than food on his mind. One afternoon, he stole a warm woolen shirt off a clothesline. The next day, he returned to take an even warmer cloak from the next yard over. What a luxury it was to sleep warm at night, for the first time in months, and on a full stomach to boot. Eventually, his taste for variety resurfaced with his restored health. He began to recognize just how grotesque the flavor of belly vengeance could be. That's when Peter began stealing fruits and whole vegetables from the open stands on market day. He enjoyed whole apples and pears, and once even an actual orange, which had to have been shipped in, at great cost, across the seas and down the Weser from some distant shore. And he also cursed himself for not thinking of this sooner, for with the first winter snowfall, market day would be discontinued until the following spring. It wouldn't be long at all before the remaining fruit and vegetable supply was stored away in deep cellars and stout wooden lockers where he couldn't get at them. For the first time, he began to think of some way to steal a larger supply of food all at once, more than what he needed for just a single day's repast. Surviving the winter would largely depend on whatever he did now to store enough supplies to last him through the cold months to come. There were two problems to overcome: how to steal a large provision all at once, and where in the city to hide his food cache, where it would be safe, both from city authorities and others like him. He considered his dilemma as he surreptitiously stalked an onion seller who'd lost half of one leg in some previous misadventure. Stealing a few of his onions would be easy enough, but his stand was deep inside the market grounds that some of the other vendors might try to intercept him in his getaway. There was one idea he'd been holding in reserve for some time, because it was likely to work only once. Pausing at still a dozen paces distant from his intended target, Peter suddenly pointed due south towards the cathedral wall and shouted in panic, "Soldiers! Goblin troops coming up the street of Bakers in great numbers! They're killing all they catch!" It worked marvelously. Some vendors and shoppers surged to the southern boundary of the market square, crowding each other to see if the warning were true. The remaining vendors tried to flee in every possible direction. In the first surge of panic, no one seemed to be watching Peter or the produce stalls immediately around him. Almost leisurely, he filled his pockets with sweet onions. Then, perceiving that he had more time, he stepped over to another stall and filched 3 fat potatoes and, wonder of wonders, an entire slab of uncut bacon. Hiding all of his loot inside his jacket, which in turn was concealed under his cloak, Peter made his way slowly through the crowd, which was still entirely focused on locating where the danger was. 10 minutes later, he was outside of the market square, free of the crowds. He walked west towards the waterfront, along the street of boats, changed direction as soon as he could, north along Theatre Street, and then doubled back on himself, turning east along the short and narrow Barrel-Maker's Street. He began to relax just a little, certain that he hadn't been followed. He was wrong, of course. On the last sunny day of the year, Carl the Arrow watched Peter from a distance, not knowing who he was and not much caring. It was enough that Carl had seen him before, and on that past occasion, as in this one, Peter had been engaged in the act of bold and open thievery. He observed from a distance and noticed, not without admiration, as Peter threw the entire market crowd into a panic with only a few well-chosen words. When Peter had completed his theft and had worked his way free of the market area, Carl followed, always at a discreet distance, and always so slyly that Peter never suspected he was being followed. When Peter entered the narrow Barrel-Maker's Street, Carl let a short but heavily weighted wooden truncheon fall into his palm. When Peter turned a sharp corner into an even darker and narrower side avenue, Carl rushed forward, silent as a monk's prayer, raising his truncheon on high. Peter had only begun to sense his danger and turn around when Carl the Arrow struck hard. After an indeterminate time, Peter began to awaken, slowly and with great effort. He was dizzy and nauseated, and there was a vicious pain thundering in his head, pounding over and again like the unstoppable beat of an ironsmith's hammer. He was lying on a stone floor, covered with old, damp straw. He could feel the scratchy, prickly straw ends sticking into his face. He reached for his head and felt dried blood in matted hair. His face and neck also seemed to be crusted with dried blood. "How long have I been here?" he silently asked himself. "And where exactly is the here that I've landed myself in?" He raised himself up a bit on unsteady arms and looked around. He was in a small, dark room, but not so dark that he couldn't make out any details. The floor and walls were made of dressed stone. There was partially dried vomit and the smell of urine mixed in with the straw directly beneath him. "Both for me," he thought, recognizing that there was an acid taste in his mouth and a dampness in his clothes to match the smell in the straw. There were no windows, but there was a single stout wooden door set within one of the walls. The little light that was in the room entered through a small window cut high into the door. It was only a short, narrow slit, not nearly enough to escape through. He thought of escape because it was all too clear that he was trapped in a prison cell. "The gobs finally got me," he said aloud this time, in a voice that cracked and strained to summon barely a whisper. Taking an infinite amount of time, Peter struggled to sit up and place his back against the far stone wall, where he could sit and regard the single locked door. He knew it would be locked with the same certainty that he knew day followed night. He didn't need to further pain himself making the useless effort to test it. After sitting for a long while, listening to the pounding behind his forehead and letting his vision drift into and out of focus, but gradually more into focus than out, he thought to examine himself. He knew he'd been whacked solidly in the head, but there might be other injuries. He felt here and there over his aching body, and in so doing made a surprising discovery. Everything he owned was still there, including frost in its case. He opened it to make sure. And even the 6 onions, 3 potatoes, and large slab of bacon he pilfered. Everything. Why would the gobs let me keep my stolen goods, or anything at all for that matter? In one corner there was a small wooden pail he hadn't noticed at first. Crawling over to it, he found it full of pure, sweet water. Realizing only then how thirsty he was, Peter drank deeply. Later, he slept. When he woke again, he first noticed that the small shaft of light coming through the door's slit window had moved considerably. Its angle was much higher in the tiny room, indicating that the sun outside was much lower in the sky. Even later, he woke again to find the room was completely dark, not recalling that he'd slept again. Sometime during the night, someone had come in to refill his water pail. Much later still, when the diffuse shaft of light was once again present in his cell, they came for him. "So what do you think?" someone said from the open doorway. There were 2 of them, just vaguely man-shaped silhouettes backlit by the grey daylight. "Are you going to live?" He could hear the soft sound of rainfall behind the 2 men. "I think so," Peter answered, "though my head doesn't agree." "My fault for that," the same man said. "I didn't want to have to hit you more than once, but still make sure you dropped without a sound. Perhaps I overdid it. Can you stand?" Peter didn't try to answer, since speaking audibly was still difficult. Instead, he simply tried to stand, using the wall behind him to brace himself. It took some time, and there were a few false starts, but eventually he succeeded. Somewhere along the way, the realization sank in that he wasn't a prisoner of the goblins, and probably not of any other civil authorities either. Who then? He wondered. "I see you've drunk your fill a time or 2, but have you eaten anything yet?" Once again, it was the same fellow speaking. "I noticed you were fully provisioned when we first met. Of course, we couldn't allow you a fire in here to cook some of that delicious-smelling bacon, but some of the other things stashed all about you look tasty enough." You didn't take any of it, Peter said. His voice was less of a discordant croak by then, but only just so. No, of course not. Why should we? It's one of the cardinal rules of the Brotherhood. Thieves don't steal from each other. He's no brother of mine. The other one spoke for the first time. Not yet, Joseph, and maybe not ever. We'll see. We'll see, Joseph echoed. Taking Peter by each arm, Joseph and Karl, as the other fellow introduced himself, took Peter out of the cell, supporting him when he needed it, but not dragging him or treating him roughly. They stepped outside into a yard that had been used during the year as a vegetable garden, judging by the patches of open dirt dressed into a series of long, narrow furrows. It was raining, but only lightly. A glance up at a grey sky, full of darkening clouds, promised harder rain to come. The yard was enclosed by a high wall, built out of the same stone as the small outbuilding that Peter had been kept in. Across the yard was a larger limestone building with an outwardly curving wall and a high domed roof that supported a spired crossing tower in the center of it. A church? That's right, Joseph chuckled. You're going to church to give your confession and then be judged, he added, which seemed to further amuse him. It's not a church any longer, Karl said. The Empire soldiers closed them all down when they took over. Well, most of them anyway. They couldn't completely close the two major cathedrals, could they? Not without riots. But these smaller churches now sit empty, until the big powers back in wherever they came from decide whether or not to allow our religion and our gods on their list of approved deities. They stopped under the sheltered entryway into the main building. Now that Peter's eyes had adjusted to the daylight, he could see that Karl and Joseph were hardly the grown men that he'd first thought them to be. Though both boys were clearly older than he, it was clear that they were still boys, 15 or 16 years at the most, but both of them looked prematurely hardened by the lives they'd led. Both were dressed in rude, unremarkable clothes like his, but theirs were better mended. Karl had reddish hair and blue eyes. Joseph's hair might have been dark blonde or maybe light brown. It was hard to determine while it was wet with the rainfall. With all these fine buildings lying empty, Karl continued, it seemed a shame to let them go unused, so the Brotherhood moved into this one. And a few others, Joseph added. But here's the important thing, Karl said. We've gathered today in this place to hold a trial. Your trial. You're going before the king, and he's going to decide if you can continue to live among us, or if we have to kill you. Those are the only two options. Trial for what? Peter said. What crime? Thievery, Joseph said. But you said you were thieves too. Correct, Karl said. But we are sworn members of the Brotherhood, aren't we? We pay our tributes upwards and properly split our takes into the prescribed shares, don't we? You didn't do any of that. Unauthorized thieving is your crime, Joseph said. Karl kept talking before Peter could ask more questions. What's your name? He said. I don't want to say. Well, you should, Karl said. If I'm going to speak for you, I'd better be able to act as if I know you well enough to trust you, and I'll have to call you something, won't I? So tell me your name, or I'll consider standing silent. I'm Peter. It's fine to meet you then, Peter, Karl said. So listen close. We can't keep you out here all day, answering your questions and giving you advice. The king won't abide waiting, nor should he, right? Otherwise, what's the advantage of being king? Here's what you need to know. The moment we walk in there, the trial has started. Don't speak to anyone but the king, and then only to answer his questions. Don't try to lie to him. He always catches the lie and never forgives it. If there's something you simply refuse to answer, then just say so, and pray for clemency. It's rare that he grants any, but not unheard of. Now, are you ready? "It doesn't matter if he is or not," Yusuf said. "It's time." They opened the door and ushered Peter in to see the king.